Okay, so the first thing I want to do, last class I tried to play a video for talking about conformity, and the audio wouldn't play. So I'm going to try to play this again. It should be working now. If it's not, just let me know in the chat, but this should give you sound as well when I play this. As I mentioned last class, this is a clip from the show Candid Camera. This is back like in the 50s, so it's black and white. They basically put people in weird situations and film their reactions. So in this case, they've got a bunch of people who are on an elevator who are all instructed to do various things when a real person gets on the elevator to see how that real person reacts. So let me know in the chat if this does not play audio, but it should.
The gentleman in the elevator now is a candid star. These folks who are entering, the man with the white shirt, the lady with the trench coat, and subsequently one other member of our staff, will face the rear. And you'll see how this man in the trench coat tries to maintain his individuality, but little by little, he looks at his watch, but he's really making an excuse for turning just a little bit more to the wall. Now we'll try it once again. Here's the candid subject. Here comes the Candid Camera staff, 3 of them at least. And this man has apparently been in groups before. Here's a fella with his hat on in the elevator. First he makes a full turn to the rear and Charlie closes the door. A moment later, we'll open the door. Everybody's changed positions. Now we'll see if we can use group pressure for some good.
Sorry guys, the video froze on my end. I'm not sure if it froze on my end.
Pressure for some good. Now, in a moment, on Charlie's signal, everybody turns forward. Notice they take off their hats. And now, do you think we could reverse the procedure? Watch.
All right, that is a pretty classic clip from the show Candid Camera, and I think it shows the power of conformity to some extent. Now, if you ask why did these people conform, remember that there's 2 reasons why people conform. We talked about last class, right? They can conform due to informational influence, when you believe other people are correct in what they're doing, so you're trying to be correct. Or we could conform due to normative influence, when we're conforming not because we think other people are engaged in the correct behavior, but simply because we don't want to experience the negative social consequences associated with not conforming. And you could argue probably most of that conformity is due to normative influence. People just didn't want to stand out. They felt really uncomfortable not doing the same thing everyone else was doing. You could argue that in some elevators, they might have doors in the front and in the back. And so it could be the case that maybe some people believe the back doors were opening because everyone was turning around. So in that case, they'd be conforming due to informational influence because they would believe other people were correct to face the back of the elevator. But if there weren't doors in the back, of course, then people weren't conforming for that reason. They're simply conforming due to normative influence. Okay, so I want to pick up talking about persuasion. And in particular, I'm talking today about the elaboration likelihood model, or the ELM for short, which is the dominant theoretical model within social psychology that we use to explain how people are persuaded. And so I just very, very briefly introduced the concept last class, where I mentioned that according to the model, persuasion can occur in a couple of different ways, depending on how motivated and able we are to really process a message deeply, to really think about what the message is telling us. Another way of saying that is that according to the elaboration likelihood model, we can be persuaded along one of 2 routes. We call them different routes to persuasion. One of those routes is known as the peripheral route to persuasion. The peripheral route to persuasion occurs when we're either not able to think in depth because we're distracted or we just don't have the cognitive resources available, or maybe we're able to think in depth, but we just don't want to because we don't like to think in depth a lot of the time, right? Under those conditions, we're not really going to analyze and process the message that is being shown to us because we don't want to, we're not motivated to, right? And so under those conditions, we tend to be more persuaded by sort of simplistic cues, generally cues that are more or less irrelevant to the message that is being given us. So if you think about commercials and ads, right? A lot of commercials, whether it's television commercials, radio commercials, ads in magazines or newspapers, a lot of them use certain techniques, things like humor, right? They want their commercial to be funny, let's say, or maybe they use an attractive spokesperson. So for instance, in this beer ad, we've got an attractive woman who's holding the beer, right? Now, that woman has nothing to do with the quality of the beer. She's completely irrelevant, right? Like who the spokesperson is completely irrelevant to whether you should buy that beer or not. But if the audience is on the peripheral route to persuasion, they're not really thinking in depth, then they tend to be persuaded by things like the attractiveness of the person in the ad, or whether there's humor in the ad. Source credibility is things like, if you've seen commercials where they have like an actor dressed up as a doctor and they are talking about some benefits of some sort of product, it'll often say in the bottom of the screen, like, this is a paid actor. But the fact that there's someone dressed up like a doctor telling you these things, telling you that you should buy this, or you should get this medical drug or something along those lines, can persuade people if we're on the peripheral route to persuasion. It's kind of like we think, well, if they're a doctor, we'll just agree with them. And that way I don't have to analyze the message in depth. Or if you can imagine, if someone is speaking to you, trying to persuade you of something, the more fluent they are, right? So the more they speak in full sentences and fluent sentences, and they avoid and ah, and it's not jilted. If they're fluent, people tend to be more influenced by that if they're on the peripheral route to persuasion. Or if someone comes in and gives you 5 arguments for why you should adopt their position, whatever argument they're making. If they give you 5 arguments versus if they only give you 2 arguments, we tend to be more persuaded if people give us more arguments or longer arguments without even processing what those arguments are. It's kind of like a heuristic that we have. You can kind of think of these as heuristics, right? Shortcut judgments. Instead of having to analyze the content of each of those arguments, you could just say, well, if they give me 5 arguments, that's good enough. I'm just going to believe that person. Or if they only give me 1 argument, I'm not going to believe that person. But you note that these things will influence people without those people actually thinking about the content of those messages. But importantly, that only happens if the audience is on the peripheral route. We're going to talk in a minute about what can put people on the peripheral or central route. This is a ketchup bottle. So a number of years ago, Heinz ketchup came out with like bottles where they had little sayings from, celebrities on them. So in this bottle, Lindsay Lohan says burgerlicious, right? Like, I don't know about you, but I don't go to Lindsay Lohan to figure out what kind of ketchup I should buy. I don't think anyone does, right? So why is it that Heinz would pay Lindsay Lohan to put her name on these ketchup bottles? Well, it's because people who buy ketchup are often on the peripheral route to persuasion. Right. And one of the things that affects people on the peripheral route to persuasion is things like celebrity. And so having a celebrity spokesperson can influence people to be more likely to buy ketchup, even if that celebrity has nothing to do with ketchup at all. And Carlos, you mentioned the Carl Jr.'s ads. Yeah, I'm not sure if you're talking about the same ones I'm thinking of, but I know a number of years ago, there was one with Paris Hilton in a bikini eating Carl's Jr. I don't know if that's the one you're talking about, but yeah, that would be a great example of them assuming the audience is going to tend to be on the peripheral route because they're using like an attractive celebrity to try to sell their burgers. In contrast to the peripheral route, the other route you could be on is known as the central route. Okay. If you are on the central route, then what that means is for whatever reason, you are motivated and able to really think about the content of the message that's being given you. right? So if you're on the central route, you're not really going to care about the attractiveness of the spokesperson or whether there's humor involved or whether it's celebrity who's selling the product, because those things are all irrelevant to the message, right? So rather, what you're going to rely on are things like whether the arguments that are being given make sense, whether there's coherence to those arguments. You're going to pay attention to the quality of the arguments. In fact, as a general rule, if you're on the central route to persuasion, the only thing you care about is the strength of arguments. If you're on the peripheral route, you care about all sorts of things, right? Humor and attractiveness and celebrity. But if you're on the central route, the only thing you care about is the strength of the arguments that are being made. It's, I think, a little harder to find examples of commercials that assume people are on the central route. And part of the reason for that is because if you've got a company like Pepsi trying to sell you their beverage, they know that people aren't really going to pay a whole lot of attention and to think really in depth about whether they should buy Pepsi or Coke or Mountain Dew, right? Because who cares? We were spending like $2 to get a drink, right? So people aren't really motivated to think in depth about it. And as a consequence, they design their ads to assume people are on the peripheral route. But if you are, let's say, selling a house or a car, things that are a lot of money, well, because they're a lot of money, people are going to tend to be more motivated to think in depth about those products, right? So when you get more expensive products like a house, they tend to rely more on people being on the central route. So here's an example. There's a picture of a house. The caption below says, "Enjoy the holidays in this elegant residence set among high hedges and English gardens on over 2 acres, offered exclusively $3.25 million. And you can see that in this ad, they're not relying on attractive spokespeople or celebrities or humor or anything like that, right? Because if you're going to spend $3.25 million, you're pretty damn motivated to really think about whether this purchase is something you want to make, right? And so they give you relevant information. They give you a picture of the house. They tell you it's on over 2 acres. They tell you the price. They describe it a little bit with high hedges and English gardens, that sort of thing. As I said, that tends to be a little bit rarer because usually I think most people tend to be on the peripheral route for at least, relatively minor purchases. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about some factors that can either put us on the central route or the peripheral route. And I'm going to break the rest of this lecture down into how are persuaded variables that persuade us that fall into one of 3 categories. So first, we're going to talk about some variables associated with who the audience is, the people who are receiving the message, and how that affects how they're persuaded. Then we're going to talk about factors associated with the source of the message, the person making the argument. Then we're going to talk about factors associated with the message itself. But let's start by talking about factors related to the audience. Probably the most important factor, the most important audience-related factor that affects how people are persuaded is what's known as their level of involvement, or otherwise known as the relevance of the issue. And all this means is that if an issue is directly relevant to you, it's going to affect you, then you're going to be more motivated to think in depth about that message, right? That makes sense. If a message is irrelevant to you, and therefore you're not involved in the issue, you don't really care. Why would you waste all these cognitive resources to really analyzing a message that's not going to affect you in any way, right? So the basic idea is that if an issue is relevant to you, and therefore you're highly involved in the issue, you tend to be on the central route to persuasion. If a message is irrelevant to you, and you're therefore not involved in the issue, you tend to be on the peripheral route to persuasion, which I think makes sense. Okay. Now, I want to make something clear. So because the hurricane put us a little bit behind, like we're a class behind, I've got to skip over some material. So what I've decided to do is to skip over these graphs, which is a very, very good thing for you, because the graphs are probably the most confusing part of the semester. At least in the past, that's what I found. People struggle with understanding what these graphs are. So I'm not going to explain the graphs. You don't have to know them for the exam. I am going to talk about the study that led to the graphs, but you don't have to interpret what the graphs actually mean, okay? So as long as you pay attention to what I'm saying, that's all you need to know for the exam. Okay, so you can just kind of like cross these graphs out if you want for your notes. But here's the study on which these graphs were based. What some researchers did is they wanted to test this idea that you're going to be on the central or the peripheral route to persuasion, depending on how involved you are in the issue. So what they did is they went into a high school and they gave a talk to a bunch of high school students. And they gave that talk under one of a couple different conditions. So they gave a bunch of variations of this talk. Half of the time, oh, by the way, I should tell you that what the talk was on was the speaker was talking about how they wanted to institute these comprehensive exams that students would have to take and pass at the end of their high school career in order to graduate high school. So it would basically be a test that tests them on everything they've studied over the past 4 years that they'd have to pass, okay? So imagine a speaker comes into a high school class and gives a talk about why we want to institute these comprehensive exams. For half of the audience, for half of the talks, half of the students are led to believe that these exams are going to take place in 10 years, okay? So they will hopefully have graduated by then, right? So because these exams aren't taking place for another 10 years, these students shouldn't be very involved in the issue. The issue is not really relevant to them because what do they care if these exams are instituted in 10 years? They're not going to be around for it anyway, right? So that's our low involvement group or our low relevance group. For the other half of the students, they're told that these exams are going to take place next year. So it is going to affect them. If these exams get instituted, they're going to have to take them. Okay, so that's a highly relevant issue. Those students should be more motivated, in other words, to really think about whether these exams are a good thing. Okay, so we've got students who are randomly assigned to be either low involvement, these exams are taking place in 10 years, or high involvement, they're taking place next year. Then what the researchers do is they give one of two talks. Some of the time, half the time, they give a talk that's composed of really strong arguments for why these exams are important. So they might say things like colleges and universities are increasingly looking to scores on these comprehensive exams to determine admissions. Okay, which sounds like a pretty good argument. I mean, if you can't get into a university unless you pass these exams, that's a pretty good argument for having these exams, right? So that would be an example of a strong argument. For the other half of the students, they hear a talk that's composed of primarily weak arguments. Things like, the administration was kind of curious to see how students would do on these exams, which is not a very good argument for having these exams, right? So you've got students who hear either strong arguments or weak arguments for why these exams are important. And then after the talk is over, the researchers simply ask the students whether they agree with having these exams. Now, what they showed, and this is what the graph shows, but I'm not going to walk you through the graph again. It's a bit confusing. But what they basically showed is that if people were really involved in an issue, they had high involvement in the issue, okay, then they paid attention to the strength of the arguments. They could tell if they got really strong arguments or really weak arguments. They were really influenced by the strong arguments and not influenced at all by the weak arguments. That's if they were highly involved in the issue. But if they were not involved in the issue, they basically didn't care about the strength of the arguments. They weren't any more influenced by the strong versus the weak arguments because they weren't even paying attention to the arguments. So that supports this idea that if an issue is relevant, then you are going to pay attention to the strength of the arguments because you're on the central route. And if an issue is not relevant, you don't care about the strength of the arguments. You're kind of too mentally lazy, in a sense, to really think about these arguments for an issue that's not going to affect you. Okay, so what that study showed then is relevance or level of involvement can lead people to go on the central route to persuasion. Okay, so just ignore that. All right. Ignore all these graphs here. All right. So that's one factor that affects how we're persuaded. A second factor related to the audience that affects how we're persuaded is what's known as need for cognition. Now, need for cognition is an individual difference variable, meaning it's kind of like a personality trait that varies from person to person, from individual to individual. Therefore, it's an individual difference variable. And what need for cognition refers to is the extent to which we enjoy thinking. I've said in general in this class that people generally don't like to think, which is true, but there is some variability on that. That's more true for some people than for others. Some people are okay with thinking more, and some people don't like thinking at all. And that's what need for cognition is picking up on. Okay. Oops, sorry. So I could, for instance, figure out everyone's need for cognition in this class by simply administering a need for cognition scale. And that need for cognition scale is comprised of a number of questions that assess how much you like to think. So questions like this. And you can see in reading some of these items that you can see what the test is getting at, right? So number 4, I like tasks that require little thought once I've learned them. 2, thinking is not my idea of fun. You can see that it's getting at how much people like to think. And so by calculating people's scores based on how they respond to the scale, you can calculate for any given person how high of a need for cognition they have. And so if you really like to think a lot, then you tend to have a high need for cognition score. And if you don't like to think very much, you have a low need for cognition score. So the basic idea here, and you don't need to know any of those items for the exam. You don't need to know any of these. Okay. But the basic idea here is that if people have a high need for cognition score, they're high need for cognition, meaning they like to think, then those people are going to tend to analyze the arguments that are being made to them, right? Because they like to think, they like to analyze arguments. So that means they're going to tend to be on the central route to persuasion. Whereas people who don't like to think very much, who are therefore low in need for cognition, they're not going to be on the central route to persuasion because that requires them to analyze arguments, which is what they don't like to do. So they're going to tend to be on the peripheral route to persuasion. So what that means is that if you were giving a talk to someone, if you were trying to persuade a group of people of something, then how you design your arguments will depend on whether your audience is in general high or low in need for cognition. If you're talking to people high in need for cognition, then you should be giving them really strong arguments for your position, right? And if you're talking to people low in need for cognition, it's not going to matter much if you give them strong arguments because they don't care. They're not going to analyze the strength of the arguments. What's going to matter more are things like having an attractive spokesperson or using humor or things of that nature, all those peripheral route factors that we've talked about before. Now, obviously, need for cognition is I shouldn't say obviously, but need for cognition is a continuous measure. It's like a scale, right? So it's not like you're either high or low. You're just somewhere along that scale. And so the higher you are, the more likely you're going to be on the central route. The lower you are, the more likely you're going to be on the peripheral route. Okay, so again, you can just ignore these graphs here. But the basic idea, again, I'll describe the study that this graph is based off of. It's just like the first study we talked about. The only difference, so that, again, this is the speaker coming into a high school talking about how they want to institute these comprehensive exams, okay? But instead of telling the students that they're going to be instituted either in 10 years or next year, they're telling everybody that they're going to be instituted next year, okay? So it's a relevant issue for everybody. But now what they've done is they've administered this need for cognition scale to all of the students in that room. And so based on their scores, they can divide the audience into those people who are high in need for cognition and those people who are low in need for cognition. And then they give a talk about why we should have these exams, and they give either strong arguments for half the participants or weak arguments for the other half of the participants. And what they showed, consistent with their hypothesis, was that among those students who had scored high on the need for cognition scale, so they had high need for cognition, they paid attention to the strength of the arguments. They're really influenced, they're really convinced by good arguments, and they're not convinced at all by weak arguments. So they paid attention to the arguments. But people who were low in need for cognition, they didn't care if the arguments were strong or weak. It's almost like they didn't notice if they were strong or weak. They weren't even paying attention to the strength of the arguments. So again, what we're seeing is that people who are high in need for cognition are on the central route to persuasion, and they pay attention to the arguments. And people who are low in need for cognition are on the peripheral route, and they don't pay attention to the strength of the arguments. Okay, so we've talked about 2 audience-related factors then that affect how we're persuaded. I'll talk about a third one quickly. So again, we've seen at numerous points in this class some differences between individualist Western cultures versus collectivist Eastern cultures. And that cultural difference can affect how people are persuaded as well, because we tend to respond to certain types of messages depending on the culture we're a part of. So in this country, in this culture, Western culture, because we tend to have an individualist orientation, we tend to respond more to arguments that amplify or that exemplify that sort of orientation. So for instance, in this culture, we see ads that have these types of slogans: "You, only better," "A leader among leaders," "Make your way through the crowd." And all of these slogans are aimed at an audience that likes the idea that they stand out from the group, right? "A leader among leaders, make your way through the crowd," right? And that is partly culturally bound, right? We like that in this culture. We like thinking that we're different from other people in this culture. But that idea is sort of threatening to people from Eastern cultures. Remember, in Eastern cultures, people like the idea of fitting in with each other. They don't like the idea so much of standing out. And as a consequence, the slogans often used in more collectivist Eastern cultures are a little bit different. So they tend to be things like this. "Our family agrees with this selection of home furnishings," or "We have a way of bringing people closer together," or "A more exhilarating way to provide for your family." And these slogans, you can see, emphasize the interconnectedness between people, especially between a person and their family, right? And those slogans appeal more to people from Eastern cultures. So if you're going to give a message, if you're trying to persuade people, you also need to know what culture your audience tends to be from. And you would tailor your message depending on if you're talking to a Western or an Eastern culture. So those are all factors, those three factors that are related to who the audience is of that message. Now, what I want to do is talk about a couple of factors that are related to the source of the message, the person who is making the persuasive message. And the first factor I want to talk about related to the source is that of credibility. So we tend to be, at least some people tend to be, more persuaded by what they perceive as highly credible speakers. So let's say, for instance, that, you're taking this class, right? And I've been making arguments to you this whole semester about social psychology. And presumably, hopefully, you're persuaded a little bit by what I'm telling you, in part because you perceive me as having some level of expertise. So I have a doctorate degree in social psychology, right? And so having that expertise lends me some credibility, which is therefore going to be more likely to persuade you than if I didn't have that same level of expertise. But that's kind of obvious, I think. But just having expertise is not enough to make someone credible. Because let's say that you're shopping for a used car and you go to a used car salesman. Now, that person might have a whole lot of expertise about cars, but they may not be highly credible to you because you might perceive them as being motivated to lie because they want to make a commission off of their sales, right? And so they're not very trustworthy, in other words. And so you could have someone who has a lot of expertise in an issue, but who isn't trustworthy. And if they're not trustworthy, they're not going to be very credible. So what this means is that the most credible speakers, the speakers that are most persuasive, have both some perceived level of expertise as well as a degree of trustworthiness. Again, you don't need to know these graphs. But what happened, again, just to verbally describe what happened with the study. Again, it was just like the other studies. So again, we've got a speaker coming in, and they're going to give a talk to high school students about the necessity of having these comprehensive exams that they need to take. Now what they do, again, they randomly assign half the students to be told these exams won't take place for another 10 years. So that's the low involvement group. The other half of the students, they're told these exams will take place next year. That's the high involvement group. But now, instead of manipulating the strength of the arguments, because you already know what's going to happen there, people who are highly involved are going to pay attention to the arguments. Instead of manipulating that, what they're going to manipulate is the perceived expertise of the speaker. So half of the students, when the speaker comes on stage, that speaker is introduced as being a professor in education. That's a highly credible source, an expert source, in other words. For the other half of the audience, the other half of the talks, the students are introduced to the speaker as just having a high school diploma, and that's it. They have very low expertise in education. Other than that, though, those two speakers give the exact same talk. So the quality of the arguments are identical. The only difference is that one person's introduced as a professor of education, the other person's introduced as just having a high school degree. Now, among people who are highly involved in the issue. Okay, remember, these people are on the central route to persuasion. The only thing they care about is the strength of arguments. And because the speakers give the exact same argument, regardless of whether they're introduced as an expert or a non-expert, they're influenced the same way, regardless of whether the speaker is an expert or a non-expert source, right? Because they're just listening to the strength of the arguments. They're not paying attention to expertise. On the other hand, the low involvement people, the people who don't care about the issue because it's not going to affect them, they're much more influenced by the person who's introduced as a professor of education, and they're not at all influenced by the person who's introduced as just having a high school diploma. Because in these people's minds, right, in the low involvement people's minds, they're just thinking like, I don't want to have to pay attention to all these arguments. I'll tell you what, they were introduced as a professor of education. I'm just going to believe whatever they say. Or they were introduced as just having a high school degree. I'm not going to believe what they say. And that's it. That way, they don't have to think about the actual arguments themselves. So what this means, which is a little bit counterintuitive to a lot of people, I think, is that the expertise or the credibility of the source itself is a peripheral route factor. Okay. Remember, a central route factor, the only factor that matters to people on the central route is the strength of arguments. Every other factor, including the expertise of the source, is a peripheral route factor. I just want to briefly mention one interesting phenomenon. This is unrelated to the central or peripheral route, but it's sort of an interesting phenomenon that's related to this idea. It's something known as the sleeper effect, which is sort of a counterintuitive effect. What the sleeper effect refers to is you might learn about a message at first, which you don't find very credible, and so you kind of discount it. But then over time, that message gets more credible and more persuasive to you. And the reason why that happens is the following. Let's use an example. Let's say that you are checking out at the grocery store, okay? And as you're waiting for the cashier to ring up your items, you see like the newspaper racks that are there, right? And you see on one of the newspapers there, it says something like, scientists find cure for cancer. But you see that it's in the National Enquirer. Now, the National Enquirer is not a very credible source, right? So you immediately discount that story. Like, you're not going to believe what the National Enquirer tells you. So you don't really believe that scientists have found a cure for cancer. But what happens is that over time, we tend to remember messages that we've come across, but we forget the source of those messages. So what that means is that maybe 2 weeks later, you remember reading somewhere that scientists found a cure for cancer, but you can't remember where you read it. And because you can't remember it came from the National Enquirer, it sounds more plausible to you. It's gained credibility over time. And therefore, it's persuaded you more 2 weeks later than it did when you first came across it. And that's what the sleeper effect is. It happens when you come across information that comes from a low credibility source, and therefore you don't believe it. And then sometime later, you forget the source of that information, and therefore it becomes more credible and more persuasive. Okay, so credibility matters. A second factor related to the source of the message, the person giving the message, that affects persuasion is the likability of the person who is giving that message. Whoops. Likability, just like credibility, is also composed of two components. First off, this is something we're going to see later on as well in the compliance section, and we're going to see it at a couple other points as well, that we tend to like people who are similar to us, which kind of makes sense, right? Because after all, as we've seen before in this class, we like ourselves a whole lot. And so if you're just like me and I like myself, then of course I'm going to like you as well, right? So we like people who are similar to us, people who have the same beliefs that we have and that sort of thing. And this is one reason why the majority of politicians, and I'm excluding Donald Trump here because he is just not like any other politician, but the majority of politicians like to portray themselves as average Americans, even though they might have come from really rich families. And part of the reason they do that is because if the audience perceives them as being an average American, therefore just like them, the audience tends to like them more. They're more likely to vote for that person. We also tend to like people that we find physically attractive. We're going to look at this in just a bit more depth in the attraction section later on this semester. But we tend to like people that we find physically attractive. And we also tend to like celebrities. Not everybody, but most people, or a lot of people, tend to like certain celebrities at least. And this is partly why there are all sorts of ads that use especially attractive celebrities as spokespeople, even if that celebrity has nothing to do with the product that's being sold, right? So here we've got soccer player David Beckham, who is a spokesperson for Sharpie pens, right? Now, what does a soccer player have to do with Sharpie pens? I mean, pretty much nothing, right? But because he's an attractive celebrity who's making the endorsement, people tend to find him more likable. And if he's more likable, he's more persuasive, and people are more likely to buy that product if they're on the peripheral route to persuasion. Okay, so likability, again, is one of the is another peripheral route factor. And finally, there's a third group of variables that are related to persuasion that have to do with the message itself that I want to talk about. Okay, now I'm not going to talk about peripheral or central route as far as these factors are concerned, but there's a whole bunch of these factors of how a message is delivered that can affect how persuaded we are by it. And the first couple of factors I'm going to talk about have to do with whether the message is composed of like reasoned arguments or whether they rely on an emotional appeal to the audience. So for instance, let's say that you're part of a company that's trying to decrease drug use among people in general, okay? And you could take one of two approaches. You could list off people, give like some of the negative consequences associated with drug use, right? Take a reasoned approach. Or you could take a different type of approach, what's known as a fear appraisal approach, where you try to invoke a fear-based emotional reaction on the part of the audience. So if you do these drugs, you're going to end up dead. Okay. For instance, here are some ads that are kind of like that. Cocaine doesn't make you sexy, it makes you dead. The tobacco industry made him history. Okay. These are ads that are relying on the idea that they're going to evoke some negative emotional reaction on the part of the audience. And so the question is, are these types of fear appraisals effective? Now, the answer to this question and the answer to most questions in this section is going to be, it depends. Fear appraisals can be an effective way to change people's perspective, to persuade them, if they tell the audience how to avoid the negative consequences, how to avoid the danger. So if they say things like, if you keep smoking, it's going to kill you, but if you need help, here's a number to call, right? If they tell you how to avoid those negative outcomes, then they can be quite effective. But if they don't tell you how to avoid those negative outcomes, they tend not to be effective. Because if you're a smoker and I just tell you, if you keep smoking, you're going to die, well, what's going to happen? That's going to invoke some level of cognitive dissonance on the part of these people, right? And we saw in the cognitive dissonance section that people have a really good ability to justify their behaviors and convince themselves that, for instance, smoking's not as bad as people say it is. So just by invoking fear, that in and of itself isn't sufficient to change people's minds. But if you tell them how to avoid that negative consequence, they can be an effective strategy. In fact, even the mood that people tend to be in when they come across a message can affect how they're persuaded as well. So in general, when you feel good, when you're really happy, then you tend to be on the peripheral route to persuasion. Okay? And that's partly because when we're in a happy mood, we tend not to want to just think about something in depth. We want to focus on our happiness, right? We don't want to distract ourselves with analyzing an argument. And so if you're feeling good, you tend to be more persuaded by these peripheral route factors. You tend to be more likely to be persuaded by things like the attractiveness of the person, of the spokesperson. Whereas if you're in a negative mood, you might be more willing to analyze the strength of arguments. So it's not that being in a happy mood or a sad mood necessarily makes you more or less persuadable. It's just that being in a happy mood tends to put you on the peripheral route. Being in a negative mood tends to put you on the central route. And there's a number of studies that are consistent with this. There's studies that have shown that when people are watching a TV show and they're snacking, they tend to be more likely to respond to peripheral route commercials during that show than if people are not snacking, with the idea being that snacking makes us happy. Being happy puts us on the peripheral routes. We're persuaded by peripheral route commercials. Similarly, it's also been shown in some studies that people who are watching comedies are more likely to be on the peripheral route than people who are watching dramas, because again, they're in a happier mood. Okay. So there's a number of variables associated with this idea of whether you should appeal to someone's reason or their emotion. Another factor that's related to the message is that of discrepancy. Discrepancy means, let's say that you're going to give a talk, you're trying to persuade people, right? And let's say that your audience has a very different position than you have. And you want to be maximally persuasive. You want to pull as many people as far as you can towards your position. And you could adopt one of two strategies. One strategy is you can give a talk that's very, very discrepant from your audience. It's the exact opposite of what your audience believes, in the hopes that that'll at least draw some people a little bit towards your side. That would be a highly discrepant message. Another strategy is that you take a message that's only a little bit discrepant from your audience and see if that'll pull people closer to your side. So how discrepant should your message be from the audience? Very discrepant or not so discrepant? This guy here in the bottom right, he's a member of the Westboro Baptist Church, which is a kind of let's say a cultish organization, a very extreme organization that takes a very discrepant position for most people. What they do, among other things, is they picket funerals of American soldiers who died in battle while holding up signs saying things like, "Thank God for dead soldiers, you're going to hell," that sort of thing. Okay, these are basically really awful people, really, really awful people. And the question is what they're doing when they picket these funerals is an effective strategy? Obviously, the signs are holding up are very, very discrepant from the positions of people who are at that funeral, obviously, right? So the question is a very discrepant position actually useful at changing people's minds? And as you can probably imagine in this case, no, it's not at all, right? Because if you are someone, if you've lost a loved one who's a soldier, and you're at that person's funeral, and you see this guy picketing, holding signs saying, "Thank God for dead soldiers," you're not going to give this guy the time of day. You're not going to go over to him and ask him to explain his position, right? You're going to immediately ignore him. And that's what happens. If you're in the audience and you hear someone make an argument that's so different from yours that you're just going to ignore that person. You're not even going to think about their arguments, right? So what that means is to be maximally persuasive. Adopting a position that's only moderately discrepant, it's only a little bit discrepant from your audience, tends to be the best strategy. That tends to result in the most persuasive messages. Or what about this? Let's say that you're part of a debate. So you're going to give an argument for your position in front of an audience, and someone else is going to give an argument for their position. Now, the question is, should you make what's known as a one-sided message or a two-sided message? What this means is the following. A one-sided message is a message that gives your viewpoint, but does not acknowledge your opponent's viewpoint. A two-sided message is one where you give your viewpoint, you acknowledge the opponent's viewpoint, and then you try to shoot it down. So the question is, should you mention your opponent's viewpoint or not if you're trying to be maximally persuasive? Well, as usual in this section, it depends. Okay, so making a one-sided argument tends to be more persuasive to an audience if the following criteria hold. First off, if the audience already agrees with you, if you're already on the same page with your audience, then it doesn't much make sense to bring up your opponent's perspective, because why would you make them aware of these other messages, of the other point of view? They already agree with you, right? So a one-sided message is better if the audience already agrees with you, and if the audience is not aware of the opposing views, right? If they don't know what the counter arguments are, then by you bringing them up, you're making them aware of those arguments, and that might change their mind in the opposite direction. So if they're not aware of opposing views, then you should tend to want to give a one-sided message to be most persuasive. But in all other situations, two-sided arguments are more persuasive. which sort of makes sense, right? If you have an audience that has people that don't already agree with you, or that are aware of alternative points of view, these opposing views, well, if you only talk about your side, they're still going to have these opposing views that you haven't rebutted in any way, right? But if you bring up the opposite side, the views they already know about, and you shoot them down, now you can try to undermine their perspective. The chat seems to have died out. You guys are still with me, right? There's people that are still listening to me, right? I'm not just lecturing to a blank wall, correct? Perfect. Love to hear it. It's very strange lecturing online when I can't see people in front of me. Okay. One more question. So let's say that you are giving a speech, your opponent is giving a speech in some debate, and then the audience at some later point is going to have to make up their mind about which one they believe. Question is it better to go first, or is it better to go last? And as you should know from the section, the answer is it depends. In particular, it depends on the timing. So it depends on the timing between when you give your talk versus when your opponent gives their talk, and the timing between when the last person gives their talk and when the audience has to make a decision. So in particular, here's what it looks like. Let's imagine that someone's giving a first message, message one. The opponent is giving the opposite perspective, message two. And at some point later, the audience has to make a decision. Okay, so you can imagine something like, a prosecutor makes an opening statement in a court case, and then the defense attorney makes an opening statement, and then a couple of weeks later, the jury has to make a decision as to the guilt or innocence of someone. Or maybe it could be a political debate where you've got one person giving their message, a second person giving their message, and then sometime later, people vote on who they like. In these situations where there's a big time delay between the last message and the final decision, it tends to be better to go first. This is somewhat related to, in cognitive psychology, what we call the primacy effect. And the primacy effect basically means that when you're presented with a list of items, the items in the very beginning of that list, you tend to remember better later on. And part of the reason for that is because if you go first, you frame the whole debate. And because of things like, remember, confirmation biases, that when people have a pre-existing belief, they tend to interpret everything else consistent with that belief. So by going first, you're creating the initial belief in the audience, so that when the audience hears the second message, because of confirmation biases and things, they're going to tend to interpret it in light of that first message. And so going first tends to be better in these situations. However, there are other situations where maybe someone gives a first message, and then there's a time delay between the first person and the second person, and then a decision is made afterwards. And under these conditions, it tends to be most persuasive if you go last. And this is somewhat related to, in cognitive psychology, what they call the recency effect, which basically says that when you are presented with a list of items, the items at the very end of that list tend to be remembered better. And the reason that the recency effect exists, why that occurs, is because that second message is fresh on your memory if you're making a decision immediately after hearing that second message. It's possible that you might have forgotten a bunch of aspects of the first message because of this time delay, but that second message is fresh on your mind. And because it's fresh on your mind, it tends to be more persuasive. So it completely depends on the time delay between the first and second message, between the second message and the decision. Okay, what about subliminal messages? So a lot of you, I'm sure, have heard of subliminal messages, right? So these are messages that are or can be presented to you at a level below your, basically below your level of awareness. Okay, so it's possible, for instance, that on the computer screen that you're looking at right now, I'm flashing a message just in a matter of like microseconds. That's so quick, it flashes on the screen so quickly, you're not even aware that you saw that message. Or I can create some sort of ad where I hide a message in the ad that you can't see, okay? And the question is, are these types of subliminal messages, can they affect our behavior? Are they actually persuasive or not? This was, I think, largely brought to the attention of a lot of people back in, I think it was the 1950s or so. There's a guy who owned a drive-in movie theater, And he claimed that when he would project movies on the screen, he would flash the messages, eat popcorn and drink Coke so quickly that they didn't register in people's minds. So he basically presented them subliminally. And he claimed that when he presented those messages on the screen, that increased Coke sales and popcorn sales. And after he made those claims, people started to get really concerned, because if that's true, then that means that all sorts of people and organizations can be presenting us with subliminal messages all the time, and we wouldn't be aware of it, and we just sort of be responding robotically, right? We'd be persuaded by those messages we're not even aware of getting. And in fact, some grocery stores started to put subliminal messages in the back of like the music that plays in the background. They'd have like a voice saying something like, "If you steal, you'll get caught." But they would present that at sort of an audible level that's so low that you weren't even aware that you were hearing that. But the idea was that if you heard that subliminal message, you'd be less likely to steal. In fact, the band Judas Priest was brought to trial over a claim like this. So the claim was that there were these two teenagers who killed themselves, and the parents of those teenagers sued the band Judas Priest because they claimed that their kids listened to Judas Priest all the time, and that Judas Priest had included some subliminal messages in their music that led the kids to kill themselves. Now, eventually, that case was thrown out. It didn't have any merit. And it was eventually found out that the guy who owned the drive-in movie theater, he didn't actually include any subliminal messages. He just made that up. He was just trying to get publicity for his drive-in. So he just made up this story about presenting people with subliminal messages. However, the concept at that point that subliminal messages can influence us had permeated culture. And in fact, you can go online and you can find people who will tell you that they will sell you tapes that have subliminal messages in them. And what you do is you play these tapes while you're sleeping or in background music, whatever. And in the background, subliminally, there are voices in there that will tell you messages that can supposedly change your behavior. And so I went online and found a few. These companies, these people claim that they can produce all these benefits for you if you buy their subliminal tapes. So there's some people who say that you can lose weight by listening to these subliminal tapes, or that you could stop smoking, that you can boost your self-esteem, that you can increase your energy, that you can improve your memory, that you could seduce women, apparently, subliminally, that you can clear up your skin. I guess acne responds to subliminal messages, according to these people, that you can stop stuttering, you could stop your bedwetting if that's an issue for you. You could get rid of irritable bowel syndrome. All of these things and more can be yours if you just send these people $99.99, and they'll send you these tapes that you can listen to. Right. Problem is, none of this actually works. Okay, there have been studies that have looked at the effectiveness of subliminal messages, and what they show is that subliminal messages have basically no effect on our behavior. However, what's interesting, and what I think, Diana, what you're kind of getting at here, you're right, is that people think that their behavior changed. It's kind of like a placebo effect. So let me describe to you a study that looked at this. What these researchers did is they had participants come into their lab and they gave them a tape recording that had a subliminal message on it. Now, the subliminal messages that they put on these tapes were either messages that were supposed to help people lose weight, or messages that were supposed to boost people's self-esteem. And so they gave participants one of those two tapes and sent them home to listen to them, and then come back to the lab a couple of weeks later. But what these researchers did is they accidentally mislabeled half the tapes. So what that means is half the people who thought they were getting a lose weight tape actually got a boost your self-esteem tape. And half the people who thought they were getting a boost your self-esteem tape actually got a weight loss tape. But they don't realize this, right? So they go home, they listen to these tapes, they come back a couple of weeks later, and the researchers ask them, so over the past couple of weeks, did you lose weight? And did your self-esteem go up? They ask everybody those same two questions. And what happens is that those participants who believed they got a weight loss tape say, yeah, I lost weight. But that's true even if they actually got the self-esteem tape. They still think they lost weight, right? And the people who thought they got a boost your self-esteem tape, they say, oh yeah, my self-esteem is way higher now than it was 2 weeks ago, even if they actually got a weight loss tape. So the subliminal messages themselves aren't having any effect on people's behavior. Rather, all that's happening is that if you believe you've been exposed to subliminal messages, that belief leads you to think that your behavior was affected by them. As a general rule, if you're not aware of receiving a message, it basically has no effect on your behavior. There are some exceptions to this in very specific circumstances, okay? And we'll talk about a couple later on. But generally speaking, if you're not aware of having received a message, it has virtually no effect on your behavior. So in other words, subliminal messages don't work. That does not stop people from thinking or looking for subliminal messages in movies and TV shows. And so I want to talk about a couple of them. Some of them are kind of famous, some of them less so. So there's a relatively famous one from the movie The Lion King. There's a part where, this is Simba, I think, Simba the lion, right? Kind of plops down and kicks up a bunch of dust into the air. And supposedly in this dust, you could see a subliminal message. Now, this is a really bad resolution photo. You can see this a little better. If you actually have like a DVD of The Lion King or something, you can actually see this a little better. But some people claim that you can spell out the word sex in the dust that was kicked up. Now, this is very popular among people who go looking for subliminal messages. They always claim to see the word sex. The idea, I guess, being that if people in the audience have positive connotations with sex, then if you put a subliminal message with the word sex in it, that people will have positive connotations to the movie or TV show. Again, that's not what actually happens, but that's what people often believe happens. And there are at least 3 explanations for this in The Lion King in particular, okay? First off, it's possible the animators thought that subliminal messages worked, so they did put the word sex in the dust, thinking that that's going to lead people to like the movie more. That's possible. 2 other explanations, though, that I think are both more likely. One other explanation is that the special effects team wanted to put a little Easter egg to themselves in the movie. So what they did is they put the acronym for special effects, which is SFX, which looks a lot like SEX, right? So this might actually be SFX for special effects. That's a possible explanation as well. And a third possible explanation is that humans are really good at seeing patterns in random noise and random data, okay? And so even when there's no actual pattern in random data, people think they see patterns all the time. So it's possible this is just a bunch of random dots that people have created in their minds, this word sex, because they went looking for it, because of confirmation biases, things like that. Here's an example. These are Pepsi cans that were released in the 1980s. And if you line them up the right way, then it spells the word sex, S-E-X, down the sides of the cans. And again, was that purposeful or was it not purposeful? I don't know. But again, people who go looking for these things, because of confirmation biases, they're going to tend to see patterns where these patterns don't really exist. This one's a little trickier, but some people say that there's a subliminal message in this ad, and I'll give you a second to see if you can find it. Does anyone see it? If you see it, say something in the chat if anyone's found it. In fact, I'll make it a little easier on you. I'll zoom in a little bit. Do you see anything in here? No one's seen it? Okay. Some people say this right here spells S-E-X, sex again. I think, by the way, one of the reasons people think they see the word sex is because it's a very, very short word. And you can easily find like this, examples where something looks like a very short word. If they were looking for the word intercourse, for instance, you're not going to find the examples of the word intercourse. It's too long a word, right? So I think people are just probably seeing random things here. Here's one. I'll give you an example where the advertisers almost certainly did purposely put this message in here. So I'll give you a second to see if you can find this one. Yeah, looks like some people have found it. If you haven't found it, look in here. And you should see in the light, in the ice cubes, S-E-X right there, right? From top to bottom. So that's probably put there on purpose, right, by the people who created that ad. Now, I don't know if they did it as a joke or if they did it to try to increase sales of their gin. I don't know. The point is, it doesn't matter. Whether this message is there or not, it's not going to affect people. People aren't going to be more likely to buy the gin just because the word's in there. Okay, this is just an overview of the section. We talked about a lot of different ideas, so I just wanted to create one slide that had basically everything on it. So I'm not going to go over this because this is everything that we basically talked about today. Okay. Okay, it's 6:15, so I'm going to end things here. I've got a couple of slides left in the persuasion section. It'll take 5 or 10 minutes to get through those. So we will pick up there on Tuesday. So as I said, I'm going to send out this video or a link to this video shortly, so that if you know people in the class who weren't able to make it, feel free to let them know. I'll send out an email that they can watch this lecture then. And as I mentioned before, assume we're back in class on Tuesday unless you hear otherwise. Okay. All right, guys, have a great weekend then. And thanks for being here on Zoom with me. Have a good one, guys. Bye.